this is not a presentation. So this is going to be quite engaging, and I don't know if I can keep up with the pace of how Mr. Rajesh did, but I'll certainly try. Going up and down the stage, maybe that'll be too much for the next 1 hour. But fantastic in terms of what he had set the stage. I think it's just, I would see it as an extension of what he spoke and really making it more contextual to manufacturing, because he spoke a lot about some of the other industries and functions as well. But this will be a little more focused on manufacturing. So maybe I'll quickly dive into the topic first, and then we'll go into the case study part. So the chart that you see on the screen here, any guesses what this chart sort of represents? Any wild guesses? Doesn't have to be the right answer. We'll get to the right answer, but any thoughts that are coming to your mind? Sorry? Sorry, what is that? Deloitte offices, okay. No, I don't want to quiz you on that.
I thought that it is flight destinations that are connected.
Flights that are connected, some aviation related. Yeah. A lot of that is going on our mind from yesterday, I think.
No, yeah. From Indigo.
Yeah, Indigo, okay, very specific, not Air India. Any other? Manufacturing? Hubs. Across green manufacturing hubs. Okay, no, not. Automotive manufacturing hubs. Sorry? So what locations? Huh. Okay. What you were saying something? Cyber attacks. No. Okay. Any others? Presence of something. Yeah, obviously presence of something. Innovation? In those parts, okay, interesting. Yeah, maybe I'll try and relate that, what you're saying also. Actually, in the last session, that word came up in the last session. Say that? Ports connectivity, no, okay. So lot on ports, aviation, innovation centers, manufacturing hubs. These are the main cities. Tourism, okay. Okay, we are not getting anywhere closer to what I was thinking. So maybe I'll just give it away, right, if it makes sense. So these are all your gigafactories. And that came up in the last discussion also. Any guesses how many gigafactories are there currently? Just wild guesses. Any number, just throw any number. 100? Okay. 200, very close to, somebody said 200, 230 gigafactories are there across the world right now. And by the next 5 years, not too far, in the next 5 years, it's going to go up to 400 gigafactories. Any guesses how many are there in India right now? How many gigafactories? Does India have a gigafactory? Map source, yeah, good. At least you're reading the data. Yeah, so 3 gigafactories? That's what it looks like, but you didn't see the size of the bubble and all that, I think. Yeah, any guesses how many are there? There are 10 gigafactories in India. Obviously, some of you will know Ola is the first one, probably they said gigafactory. Then Tata has, Reliance has, and Reliance is going to come up with one of the largest integrated manufacturing setup in Jamnagar. So that's going to be one of the largest gigafactories for us. But just going a little bit further, and what you see as the visual on the right-hand side is a gigafactory. It's the BIDE Shenzhen gigafactory. That's one of the world's largest factories. And actually, if you look at by the footprint, that the scale at which it is one of the largest world's buildings in the world, right? So that's the scale of manufacturing that people are looking at. And when you look at these factories, these are like cities within a factory. They are called as cities within a factory. It's almost 32,000 acres, 32,000 acres. It has dorms, it has restaurants, it has shopping malls, it has all sorts of stadiums, everything, which is like a township that we have, the same concept of a township that we have. Each of these gigafactories, massive scale in terms of the number of people that it deploys. This one, the BIDE factory, it has almost 60,000 people who are deployed and sort of working in this factory. And each of this factory manufactures at least 1 million vehicles per year, which is unimaginable number. And some of you would have recently seen the ship in which BYD is sending these cars and these automotives, right, to other countries. And that's the scale you have to look at it. That there's a thinking now that probably BYD is going to start making ships also. Because the number of cars it has to ship to other geographies, it has to have that capacity. And these are massive numbers that you're looking at, and it is the very first time you would see that a Chinese company is actually thinking of exporting. Otherwise generally Chinese companies are their own market. They want to sell in their own market, and massive country in itself, a lot of potential for that. But BYD is one such example which is only thinking going global that way. And it is said that this particular factory is bigger than the city of San Francisco itself. So massive scale that we are looking at. So why am I talking about all these gigafactories? When you look at your own factory setup, and I have worked in some of the factories that we are talking about, there is always a constraint of time, space, money. Money is not there, so I can't invest in technology. Space is not there, so I can't add additional production lines. I don't have time. I can't I can't stop my production. It has to be continuous. All those constraints are there. But when you look at some of these gigafactories, Elon Musk, who was the first one who actually coined the term gigafactories. And any idea why these are called gigafactories? How are gigafactories measured? What is the measure for gigafactory? Louder, please, yeah. Gigawatts. They are not measured by the units that they produce. It is actually the gigapower that they produce. That's how these factories are measured. And these, first time it was termed by Tesla. And Elon Musk came up with this word gigafactory. And he used to call this as machine that builds the machine. That factory itself is a machine. That's how it operates. So maybe some of these things which really stood out. And when we sort of did this whole analysis, these are the 6 factors on which how gigafactories sort of stand out very distinctively compared to some of the traditional factories. And I would say most of us are working in traditional factories that we have currently. The first one is virtual reality meets manufacturing. Gigafactory embraces simulation first approach. And when I say that, I'll give you a live example. And Jay and Rahul, you can also add to this. The Deloitte, we have set up an innovation center called the Deloitte Center for Innovation and Technology in Bangalore. It's a 12,000 square feet facility, fairly elaborate in terms of some of the things that we want to showcase to our clients, demonstrate, not just show you PPTs like this, but actually show you some production lines that we are working on. And consultants, all of you would blame that you are very good at PPTs, but have you actually worked in shop floors? Yes, we have all worked in shop floors. At least the people who claim to be saying that we work in manufacturing. And that's why we thought we'll set up a manufacturing line itself. And that's what we did in a commercial building. In the commercial building of Prestige Trade Tower, we have this innovation center where we actually manufacture chocolates. And these are chocolate bottling unit, all of that has been set up. But the point that I was making is that it's very, the point on simulation first approach, the idea is that when you're setting up something new for the first time, and especially looking at it from a green field factory manufacturing, it's very essential that you look at it as a simulation first approach, saying, can I do a simulation? Can I do a digital twin first? And then actually put up the line, which is a very different approach from what you would have seen in your factories, that factories are designed with hardware in mind. Hardware comes first, and then the entire, what do you want to produce, how many you want to produce, all that comes very later. But what we ran into when we set up the Center for Innovation, one of the things, the few things that we ran into issues, right, in terms of how many chocolates that it is dispensing, how do I optimize the run time it is taking. All of this we had simulated first on a simulation software, and then did the whole design of the hardware. So that's how most of these gigafactories are doing now, that they are able to do the simulation first, and then sort of going and building some of these factories. The second piece that you see is the total control on the whole vertical integration. And they are mastering this vertical integration. So if you take an example of Tesla from the time it produces the battery, it produces the motor, it has its own sales centers. So Tesla doesn't have outsourced centers. It has its own sales center. They're all Tesla employees who are selling. And at the same time, it solved the last mile problem, which is basically the charging points, right? So that itself belongs to Tesla. So Tesla had gone about doing the whole integration, and the same approach has been taken by all the gigafactories, right from sourcing the raw material till the time it is selling to the customer and the customer service. Everything is owned by the same company. Unlike a lot of the manufacturing setups that we have currently, where a lot of it is outsourced, the sourcing is outsourced, the design is outsourced, assembly probably takes place in your factory, and then the selling is also through dealers and all of that. So that's a very different approach that they have taken. Third, I think all of you would be aware, that is in terms of these gigafactories, they are completely solar-powered gigafactories, and they are hydrogen-powered and all of that, but they're completely green factories. They don't rely on any of this electricity that we sort of rely heavily on. The fourth you see on this slide is the way they are built. Most of our factories, when you look at it, they are very rigid in the way they are built. It's not modular, it's very rigid, there's no flexibility. If you imagine you have to add a new production line, what does it cost? Can someone give me an example of what does it cost to add a new production line? How much time does it take? Sorry, any thoughts? 36 months to market. Imagine the time that it takes to add a new production line. These factories, when they build gigafactories, they're building it in blocks, in modules, so that if tomorrow you want to bring in a new production line, they're adding it in overnight. Overnight, the change is happening. So the changeovers, all of that is very, very rapid, which is taking place. The fifth point is on data-driven approach to manufacturing. And all of us speak a lot about this data-driven approach. And I'm sure all of you are doing a lot in terms of analyzing data, capturing all this data which is coming from IoT and all of that, right? So on an average, any idea how much data does a gigafactory produce in a day? Any thoughts how much data it might be producing? Any number? Okay, how much data does your own factory produce in a day? This number you should have. Any thoughts, any answers? It's in GBs. It's in GBs, literally in GBs, which is as good as storing it on your phone. And these gigafactories, in a day, they are producing at least 2 to 3 TBs of data in a day. And some in hours also, like this one that you saw in the Chinese Byte factory, it is hourly producing 2 TB of data. So imagine the problem and the scale of the problem that they are facing. They are facing that there's too much data. There's data which is coming from the lines, from the machines, from your people on the shop floor, the IoT sensors, all of that. And then it's vertical integration, so all of that data from your suppliers to your end customers, all of that data. How do you manage processing all of that? That's a fairly different approach that they have taken to make it more data-driven manufacturing, right? And then I think earlier when we were speaking to Ms. Devina Mehra also, she spoke a lot about this data-driven approach to investments and not making random decisions, right? So all of these decisions that the gigafactory makes in a day, all of that is dependent on data. There is nothing like, this is my tribal knowledge, this is how I run my machine. This is how I've been running for the past 15 years, I will run it like that. Cutting corners when it comes to predictive maintenance, all of that, right? So that's the fifth point. And lastly, in terms of some of these factories that are harnessing virtual precision and some of these areas that we are looking at. Any thoughts, Jay, maybe Rahul, if you want to add as well, how some of these factories are really transforming the way we think manufacturing is. It's a great example that they are setting for us to look at what can be adopted. I'm not saying that tomorrow you have to go invest some 200, 300 crores into your manufacturing. I'm sure the boss is not going to give that money also. But there are few components and learnings that are coming from here, which we should look at probably applying.
I would believe that, a lot of the digital twins that are being talked about, they would again come in different flavors, okay? So you would talk about product being designed itself, that itself is a product twin that you talk about. Someone in the audience had mentioned in the previous session about, getting it right the first time. And that's essentially what the digital twin is going to help you with. So product twin is what you're going to look at it in terms of how do you achieve the right product design? What is it that you're going to kind of get as that perfect mix of all your materials? How you would want to kind of take that forward and say, this is what I want to produce in the factory. Okay. The second part would be in terms of what you're going to talk about as the production twin, which is essentially saying how do you want to lay out the factory, which again actually brings you back to the fourth point of saying, how do you have modular design? How do you get that flexibility in? How do you test for it? And then run that on the digital twin before you actually take it to the shop floor. The third one is essentially in terms of what you're going to see as a digital twin for the running of the factory itself. When you're running the factory, when you're looking for insights to come through in terms of saying, what is it that you're seeing as the throughput of your line? How much of space do you need in front of each operation for each workstation to kind of work, to have adequate amount of WIP so that it can go forward to the next stage? Okay, that's where you're going to find the production digital twin come into play. And then beyond that, you'll take the digital twin also to do what we talk about as the operational digital twin. And the operational digital twin is essentially what you're going to talk about as how is my equipment performing? When do I start seeing predictive, prediction-based downtime come through, right? That's when you start talking about, where does AI ML come in, and how are you going to look at saying that this is when I'm going to predict that in the next 4 hours I'm going to see some form of a downtime come through, and I take that preventive measure at that point in time. And the last twin that one would talk about is essentially what's called as the service operations twin. Okay? In the context of, let's say, products that are working, I mean, and there's so many OEMs who make motors, or let's say gensets, or any kind of equipment, towers for that matter, in the context of the telecom industry. You are going to look at having all of these dispersed across a wide geographical area. And that's where you need that service operation twin to come and tell you, is that genset, is that motor, is it running? Is it working as per specification? And the moment you start getting this information back, that's when you start looking at saying, what is it that you need to put forward proactively as service to that particular customer, and look at ensuring that your product succeeds in the market. It's a bit like what the previous speaker spoke about, saying, he saw this car on the road with a wiper in an awkward position. He would want to go and place it back so that he maintains the brand of that product and says that my brand cannot stand out like this. It needs to be working. It needs to be seen in the right light. And that is what you bring to life when you're going to talk about service operation twins.
So maybe I'll one question to the audience also, right? I spoke about two things which are on the polar opposites of the screen. One is the simulation first approach, and then the last one was the digital twin. So any thoughts, and what is that on your mind? When I say digital twin and simulation, how are they different? Or probably we'll start with first, what is your definition of a digital twin? I mean, Rahul has already given away a few of the types of digital twins, and I've heard from many of our clients that when we go and meet them, they typically say that everyone sort of comes and talks about digital twin. Everyone has a different version or an answer to a digital twin. Like Rahul said, some say product digital twin, production line digital twin, there's a process digital twin, right? So any thoughts on, what's your definition of a digital twin? Yes. Virtual replica, correct. That's the, the most appropriate answer to say that this is a virtual replica of your physical environment. And when we look at simulation, what does simulation mean in the context of digital twin? Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So digital twin in itself doesn't mean anything. Right? Digital twin is just a replica of the physical environment, and then it's produced on a digital interface. But when it goes into simulation, when you're able to try different scenarios, it's actually stress testing. What can go wrong? What are the outliers? What are the things which are anomalies? in the whole system that I can identify. So simulations with digital twin is where the power really lies, right? Otherwise, it's just a basic information which is being reflected to you on you know, a digital platform. So that's where you have to bring digital twins and simulations together to be able to do all these permutation, combinations, stress testing of your environment, where things will start falling off, when will the machine go down, and you know, what are the ways in which it can be resolved? Is there a way that this machine is going to go down? Can I predict that before only? And then probably start something in parallel. So those are the ways that at which both of these should ideally come together. So moving further, what we sort of wanted to put across is this whole concept of how manufacturing is now evolving into a knowledge-based system, right? And then I think in earlier session where Rajesh was speaking in terms of the layers in which the value is migrating, you know, some of those aspects, you will see on this slide as well that a traditional architecture of a factory is very monolithic. It is very difficult to change the layers which are there at the bottom, which is your L0 layer, which is all your machines and the sensors that you have. And then moving into others, it's very difficult. It's a monolithic system. Changing anything, somebody said changing a line takes 36 months to value to the market. And similarly, moving anything is very monolithic. But when you come to now, some of the things which are already doing, I'm sure all of you are bringing in PLM to sort of do the product design and the development part of it, MES for manufacturing execution of your shop floor. I'm sure all of you are on ERP platforms and sort of creating the whole golden triangle between the three, right? PLM, MES, and the ERP systems. That's the golden triangle that we are looking at. Most of you would be in this space, which is here and now today, what we are looking at. And some of you are probably moving towards more contextualized data, which is where we call this as the knowledge graph, right? Which is basically to say that can I get, because all of this data that is coming in is at different formats, different protocols, different, you know, the way they are structured, all of that. And all of you would have struggled with that as well. Your own teams would have struggled to say that my machine data is coming in this particular protocol, but my, you know, some other data is coming in, you know, different formats. How do I bring all of this together? That's where the concept now is evolving towards knowledge graphs. And when you see, take an example of any large language models, right? All of you, the LLMs that are coming, they are all based on knowledge graph methodology or the, you know, the architecture, which is to say that data can be coming in any different format, any different structure. I will be able to bring all of that together and give you a very contextual insight about it. That data for the machine could be coming from various systems, but I still be able to identify what is the pattern that is underlying. So some organizations are moving towards that whole contextualization, bringing knowledge graphs and all of that, right? So further down, that's how you know, things are evolving. Data is, it's more data-driven manufacturing that we are moving towards. But at the bottom, what you see are the problems that still exist. We have been talking about Industry 4.0 for the last 10 years maybe, but these problems still exist. All of you face with data acquisition problems. Even today, I think there are various tools that are available which can do conversions, which can do different protocol, you know, managements and all of that. But still, with a raise of hand, can you tell me how many face data acquisition challenges? That you are not able to take data out of your PLCs, your SCADA systems. Many of them. I'm sure you're not raising your hand, but all of you face the data acquisition challenge. When I actually go and do an assessment, all of you will tell me, no, I don't have this data. Then the second comes is in terms of the IT-OT integration, the interoperability. This doesn't get solved at all. I've seen the best of the plants, but still there are ways in which IT and the OT does not work together. You know, till the time the data reaches your ERP layer, from there onwards, everything works seamlessly. The integrations into CRM and all of that works. But getting the data from IT to an OT layer, from the OT layer to the IT layer, still a lot of challenges are there. Skills. How many of you face challenges with getting the right kind of people into your organizations? People at the shop floor. Massive, massive problem. And why I say that is, and I'll ask you another question, is which is the department which has the most highest attrition? Which is the department? In any factory. Doesn't matter, oil and gas, doesn't matter, consumer, doesn't matter. It has the highest number of attrition. No, obviously manufacturing only, but within manufacturing. Sorry, automation, okay, no, not automation. Any other? Maintenance, massive attrition. People don't stay in the maintenance department and they take away the tribal knowledge. They have learned for 2 years and then they leave. Nobody knows how that machine works other than the machine manufacturer, and that's how they take you for the run, right? So massive problem around accessing the right skills. And then time to value. You spoke about time to value. How fast can I change my machines? How fast can I bring people who understand the shop floor much better than the previous person? Can I make the changes very fast and be very rapid in terms of the way I'm approaching the market? And I'm saying this in the context that consumer demands are changing every day. One day they are saying, one day there is an order which is coming on Zepto, then there is one Blinkit, and there is something else which is coming, there's a big basket. All of these are different formats in which consumers are accessing your brand. They are going on your website, they are going on your app, all of that. And what does that mean for manufacturing, right? Manufacturing is a core, that's the nerve center, to be able to cater to the customer demands. And if you are not able to respond to the customer demands, obviously we do a lot of this blame game between planning team and the marketing team and the manufacturing team, all of that. But if you are not able to respond, the changes that you cannot bring about in your lines, you are not able to meet the customer demands, and that's a lost sale for the organization itself. So these challenges continue to exist, and we continue to battle some of these. But what we are moving now is into what we call as software-defined manufacturing. And when I say that, it is not hardware-defined. It is software-defined, and that's when this is a step change that you will really see if you start looking at it from the lens that how Apple moved away from the whole hardware systems to a software, which is the iOS platform on which it runs on, right? It's a similar concept. If you want to extend that to manufacturing, imagine what you can do with manufacturing. The first one, some of the principles. I thought some of the principles on which this will work. First one is the abstraction of hardware. How many of you face this challenge of abstraction of hardware? And when I say that, maybe I'll explain first what is abstraction of hardware, which is essentially hardware abstraction allows software systems to interact with hardware through standardized interfaces. And this example that you see, there is a robotic arm from, let's say, Siemens, there's one from KUKA. Have you seen both of these companies, robotic arms working together? Does it ever happen? They will always give you the answer, no, it doesn't work. You get me, you buy one more robotic arm from Siemens. That's how it works. So that is the first level to solve. And software-defined manufacturing, that's the first principle that it will operate on. That can I remove that whole abstraction and make it more abstract? That doesn't matter whatever hardware is there. There will be an interface which will cover that, and my software will be able to interface with all of that, right? Programmability. Manufacturing processes can be configured, modified, and optimized through software without physically altering the production line. How many of you face this challenge? This is the most common challenge in manufacturing, and which basically means, can a factory switch from producing electric motors to gearboxes by simply updating the software on the workflow? Is it possible? Right now, not possible at all, completely not possible. But with a software-defined manufacturing, when you're looking at it, software will be able to update, and that's how gigafactories are operating. That's how they're making it modular, so that tomorrow if you want to add another line which is making gearboxes completely, can I do that through these interfaces? Interoperability, again, the same problem, different systems, machines, sensors can communicate together. That's how they'll start working together. Because no company, any factory that you see currently, they have grown over a period of time. You have got machines from different machine vendors, machine builders, and over a period of time you have added, somebody has given you at a cheaper cost, so you got that company. Somebody gave it to you free, so you got that also. So over a period of time, it has just become a monolith for you to be able to handle. So that interoperability will become a crucial factor when you're defining something around this. Then lastly, real-time adaptability, and I spoke to you a little bit about this, that on a real-time basis, can I adjust to my customer demands? How do I do that, right? To be able to do accurate planning, to be able to produce what the customer is asking for, and be able to change, more rapidly across this. So it was more, the concept was basically to say, can I reprogram my factory like an app store? Like from the mobiles, how do I do that? And there are many. We will probably get to that in the next 5-6 years. I'm very hopeful of that. All of you will take stride towards investing in some of these technologies. But when you look at it, all of this, I'm sure at some level you would have seen, right? These are the key technologies under Industry 4.0. But I thought I'll update this a little bit because all of this has been there for some time. But there are new things which have come up, right? AR, VR, Metaverse, Omniverse. So I'll give you an example that recently we took this whole concept of Metaverse or Omniverse that you call it. And maybe Jay, you can talk about the one that we did as well. But I'll speak first about, we have done this work with one of the largest aerospace and defense manufacturing company. And they came to us with a problem statement, saying that there is a fighter jet which has been outdated now, but they are still in production. They are still used by the defense, but we don't have any simulation or any training ways in which we can train our people. So basically means that I need to have that same fighter jet in all my training locations and train my people on that, right? And what it basically means is that you have taken away, in the country maybe there are 50 fighter jets, you have taken away 10 of them just to do training. So that's a massive revenue loss for the company itself. And that's when they came with this problem statement saying that this fighter jet, I want to simulate the whole cockpit on which my people can get trained, my pilots can get trained. And that's what we created. And this was shown during the Aero Show earlier this year as well. And essentially they were able to train a number of people, a number of pilots on top of it. And then eventually if they want to put them onto the actual fighter jet, it was much more faster. They didn't have to sort of allocate 10 fighter jets. Instead of that, they could have done it with lesser number. So that's one great example, I thought, around this. And maybe Jay, if you want to share as well.
Yeah, just a few points on Industry 4.0, right? And just to give, there is a 3 areas of Industry 4.0 which we like to talk about. So one is about instrumenting all your physical assets. I think we should be able to have the sensors worlds take the data in the real time, right? So that is one part. Second thing is that how do we best use of this particular data, right? And that's why we need to build workflows, and that's why we are building an interconnected system, right? Like if anything happening in the packaging line, then the batch process should be able to understand. And because there is a data flow through instrumentation happening, we are able to give appropriate instructions to it, right? So that is an interconnection capability. The third important aspect, which is also very important for us, the intelligence. Because we take the data from real time, because we are able to build an interconnected system, then what do we do with that? And that's where the intelligence comes in. If we're able to do all these 3 aspects on anything, then any system will become as a smarter system. So combination of instrumenting, interconnecting, and intelligent. And that's the reason a normal mobile became a smart mobile, normal factory is becoming a smart factory, and a normal TV became a smart TV. Combination of these 3 capabilities, right? What we try to do in a new greenfield expansion or even an additional brownfield capacity expansion, the land is openly available, but where to place which machines and how the people and the machines will work together. It needs a complete digital twin capability in terms of achieving what the right output we wanted. So one of the exercise what we did for one of the automotive OEM, and we are still working because this factory is still coming up on the way, is that all these robots that came in, they all were from one of the OEMs, right? And similarly, there are 2-3 OEMs had 2-3 different applications and software. I think the abstraction layer which he spoke about is one layer where we try to see that how we are able to build that interconnected system. The takt time can be 3 minutes for some products. The takt time could be 4 minutes for some product, right? And that's the reason what we try to do in the Omniverse platform is that we were able to simulate the physical assets, where to place which machines. And each of these robots had their own kinematics motions, right? And when we place these machines in a digital world, it looks different. But physically, if we go and keep it, there is actually clashes between the robots that has been happening. And some of the reasons why it is happening, because the software didn't have the capability to do a high quality rendering of the images. So when we come to the digital world also, the problem is not about that it will also solve all the problem. We need to get the real-time images, we need to get the files of the drawing, and then we need to put those drawing file in an open floor, which is on the digital screen, and then the kinematics motion of each of these robots along with the machine also needs to be developed. So slowly the complexity is also increasing. So this is one part of the area which Omniverse could help in find a solution to it, because the physics capability and the human plus machine capability is all modeled in the platform. So that is one part of the aspect which I want to do. The second important point is that the platform can also help in training of the people, right? So what it happens, something which is not supposed to happen, or even the safety training that is required. We can't break a machine and say that this is what you need to do a corrective action, or this is what you need to do as part of it. So many of these Omniverse platform is also used for training of the people in the operator, because the factory is physically not there, but still you need to go and train the people, okay, in the real-time world, if it comes in, this is how you need to operate, because the entire line is getting shifted to more machine-oriented and robo-oriented and the people-oriented, right? I just want to highlight these points. So it is not that Omniverse or the metaverse capability is only to make a digital show, but people in India, already the new greenfield factories and the brownfield capacity expansion that is happening are already started to adopt it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Maybe the second one I thought I'll pick up is the second last, which is on the GenAI, Agentic, co-pilots, LLMs and SLMs. Can someone tell me what is an SLM? You would have heard of LLMs? Large language learning models. What is SLM? Sorry? Small language models. Yeah. And is anyone able to keep up with the pace of this change which is coming? I mean, every day, if you read the newspaper, and now we don't even need to read the newspaper, it's just in your own mobile, you keep getting updates. The other day, Google had launched something which is for people who cannot speak and see, and they communicate in sign language. They have an interface now which can convert sign languages into text, which was never done before. Right, so that completely solves a different problem altogether. And then they came up with something where you would have seen, I think all of you are in your, maybe your kids or in your own organization, the younger ones are making all these fancy videos. They're just able to do that with a simple prompt. If you write a prompt in any of these large language models, it is able to come up with a video. And there have been examples where complete movies, short videos have been created on these small language, large language models. And one of the things which Google did recently was that it solved one of the major problems, that these videos were getting created, but there was no voiceover. Somebody had to do the voiceover then. So that's when Google came up with this whole idea, and now when you give a prompt, you tell the type of voice you want, you tell the type of color schemes you want, all of that. Complete movie can be made with just a simple prompt. Imagine an entire video can be made and just given to you in a click of a button, and that sort of changes the whole media space, the whole digital content that is getting created. In fact, one of our clients, they are into this whole ceramic tiles business, and they wanted to sort of release like a very customized campaign that they wanted to launch. And they came to us saying, will you create a video out of this? And we, instead of actually, creating with real people, we have done AI generated content, which is basically fake people that you would have seen in the first session slides also. All the ladies, the Nari Shakti, all those images are AI generated images. So using some of those prompts, we were able to create a very tailored, marketing campaign, saying in this region, this is the language that is spoken, this is the dialect which is spoken, this is how, the nuances of the region. We were able to tailor it, and instead of making just one campaign, at the cost of one campaign, we were able to launch 50 campaigns at the same price. And those were released, and the response has been tremendous. So these large language models are really generic ones, which is the ones that you're seeing, like the co-pilots and all of that, and the OpenAI that you're seeing. These are all very generic. You can give whatever question. It will not answer you anything which is about your manufacturing shop floor. It will not answer anything which is around your machine, because it doesn't have that context. But now the systems are moving towards small language models, which are specific for your own organization, specific for your domain that you're dealing with. So for example, there is a company which created this SLM for semiconductors. So it has completely trained the model on semiconductor knowledge base. It's called SemiKong. So it won't be too far when some of these models will be launched by your OEMs like Siemens and Dassault and all of them. where they will launch very specific to the machines that you are looking at, train them on the knowledge, because they are the ones who has all the failure modes, that when did this machine fail, and what were the probable reasons, all of that, the machine is able to capture that. So it is those companies that are making these advancements. So while in the tech world, it is the Googles and the AWS, in the industrial world, it is the Siemens and all of these which are coming up with some of these new technologies that are there. Okay, so we'll shift this a little bit, and if you see this screen, this thing on your slide on the the screen, what do you see? It says that I'm glad we are all aligned, right? And what are they doing? They are jumping off a cliff because they are all very aligned. And this, do you associate with your own organization? When it asks you not to do anything out of the usual, you have to make sure that you check with your maintenance team, you have to make sure that you have spoken to your technical department, and you have checked with the finance whether you got the approval or not. Once all of them are aligned, then you can just go jump off a cliff like this, right? But this is where a lot of the orthodoxies come into picture, and that's the the case study that we want to do as well. But what you see is these industries and companies tend to develop a set of habits and rules that shape widely the conventional thinking, right? These are the orthodoxies. So I'll do an exercise with all of you, and I would request if all of you would be a little more participating and come out with some of those. But I'll give you an example first so that all of you, sort of get the picture first. So for example, all industries have some beliefs, some orthodoxies, some conventions that they always have been sticking to, right? For example, grocery store. I mean, I have not understood this whole concept where in grocery store, and I'm from Hyderabad, so we have Ratnadeep there, and Ratnadeep has this express checkout for people who are only buying 5 items. Why do you want to give privilege to someone who's buying the least amount of, spending the least amount in the store? That's a conventional belief they have been following, and they have not broken that myth. But that's a very strong, deeply rooted belief that you have to make sure people move fast. But you are making people fast who spend the least amount of money in your store. Banks provide all critical consumer services through ATMs. Right? That's again a big myth that they are following. Rental, okay, music. People will go to record stores to buy CDs. That's the myth that people had, that they will go to a store to buy CDs. But I don't imagine, I mean, CDs have gone out of, the whole business itself. The whole business has got disrupted because of. So some of these are, the orthodoxies that have been set in our mind, that, this is how we have to do things, and that this is how things needs to run. So maybe some examples from your own industry, you think that these are things which we keep believing that work for us, but essentially they are not really, something which is helping your own organization. Any examples? Any thoughts? Any beliefs that you think have been set very deeply into your organizations? For example, I'll give you, in a very industrial setup, that, everything, I have to produce everything, right? That was a myth which was busted, and essentially we went from outsourcing some of the work, and there were many industries which follow some of those aspects, right? So those are some beliefs, and what we'll do now is we'll sort of go into the case study, and on all of your tables, we have given you a handout, and let me see, I'll try and show it to you. This is the longer case study from Harvard. So obviously, all of this can't be done in today's session. I will have to request Anand to give us one more day to do this. So to avoid that, what we have done is given you a shorter version of this. Yeah, let me see. Where is it?
Got that?
It's not there. Yeah, a shorter version of this, if I may use this. This is a 2-page summary. I'll request all of you to take about 3 to 4 minutes, just go through the case study once, and then we'll discuss, in more detail.
You could read it, but then I think practicalities told us that, maybe a 2-page summary would be something that it would be a lot easier for you. But do let us know once you're done. You've got your heads up, then we can
If
probably
anyone
start.
is done, maybe you can raise your hand. Not yet?
Great.
Okay.
So maybe we can just start by kind of, you sharing about what you see as the case study. And it's a very famous case study for sure.
Is anyone from Mahindra here? I was told there was none. Okay.
I was previously working with Mahindra.
Sorry, where is it? Oh, you were. So you probably have a good view.
Yeah, to some
maybe you
extent.
could be our starting pioneer around
At
this.
that point of time, like Mahindra was not doing that too good, that too great. And launching of Scorpio, it was around, I think, 500 or 600 crores at that point of time. When Dr. Pawan Goenka got inducted into M&M, and he was the backbone brain behind this. But at that point of time, being an insider, we thought it is very risky.
Yes.
If by chance this Scorpio launch, if it fails, then future of Mahindra would be,
Was yet-
it was very considered to be very risky at that point of time. But the efforts which Mahindra team from top to bottom, from Mr. Anand Mahindra ji down to the technician, had put, it was a collective effort, team effort, which made it as a success, and it was a trendsetter in India. And if I recall, it was adjudged as the best vehicle, best design vehicle, or best vehicle in 2002 or
All
2003, like.
Yeah.
And the competition at that point of time, where there were the established giants in the industry which had reached to that level, but M&M could steal the show at that point of time. It was a pride moment for all of us. The launch of Scorpio, and it is a success story.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
can really see that when you are narrating the story also, you can feel the passion with which he is narrating. Any other thoughts from what you have read? Anything that catches your attention?
So that was almost like an inside-out view.
Yes.
Would be great to see an outside-in view on that.
Yeah, I'm Jayanta Chaudhary from Bamalori. Actually, in a nutshell, it is telling that in every technology and aspect, you need not to be a master. Okay, what they have done, they have the mastership in some of the places, say for engineering manufacturing or some other area. But whichever the area they were weak, they have tried to outsource it and try to implement it. So it's a combination of your manufacturing and assemble, which has given a great success and time saving. If they try to do it of their own, the whole thing, the project could have cost much more and taken a much longer time. So that is the...
Absolutely right. And he said, it would have costed much more. That at the time, so Scorpio was launched in 2002. It's a dated case study, but still very relevant from a lot of perspectives in terms of innovation and resilience. He said it would have costed more. It was 500 crores that they had spent. Very accurate number that you quoted. But it was so, in the sense that it was like a do or die situation. To the extent that Anand Mahindra himself had quoted that if this had failed in his own company, the board would have thrown him out of the organization. So imagine that it was a do or die situation for them to sort of, do this.
So I had a chance of having this glimpse in IIM Bangalore, because this was also one of the case studies they presented. The touching thing is like, even though they outsourced so many things from the outside, but the soul remains Indian. That's what, That's
Beautiful. It was one of the
because-
first SUVs completely made in India.
India, yeah.
From start to finish, it was completely made in India.
Yeah.
And from the design, everything, but it's just that they broke it into pieces. And like he said earlier, they had outsourced some of this work. So any other thoughts before I sort of start?
One more thing I would
yeah.
like to end up with that. So it's not only worked out for the Mahindra, but it is for the auto industry of India. So
Absolutely.
that's a global.
And that was sort of the precedence that they had set, that's when automotive companies started looking at the whole ecosystem. So supplier collaboration, this is a beautiful example on supplier collaboration. How do you extend, how do you work with all your suppliers very closely? And one of the things, I don't know if it's mentioned there, they formed a team called IDAM, which is basically a combination of, like he said, starting from Anand Mahindra was part of this. Pawan Goenka was brought in from a different industry altogether. And they had suppliers, they had, R&D teams. R&D was outsourced, completely outsourced in this case. They had got all of them together, but they worked as one single team. No more blame gaming, no more that you have not uploaded on my supplier portal, I will not be able to provide this. All of that blame game was not there. It was with just one vision in mind that we have to launch Scorpio, right? And that's the vision that he sort of started with. Any other, yeah.
Three takeaway. The one of the transformation is not without dedication, without risk, or without out of the box thinking. So this is happened. The Scorpio is the transformation for the company or for the industry. The second part is that they identified what they are good in and what they need to get from their partners or something that. Keeping the aim what they want to build in. Third thing is the dedication and teamwork.
So just elaborating on what he said, and very, very valid point, right? It is a business transformation case, and that was the reason we wanted to put this out, that manufacturing can actually lead business transformation. It can actually change the trajectory of an organization. And why I say that? What was the previous vehicle before Scorpio was launched from Mahindra? What was it called?
Bolero.
Bolero. And what was Bolero used for?
Taxi.
BPO's taxi, right? All of you would have seen Tavera, Scorpio, before Scorpio was launched, Bolero. All of those, but very utility driven, very rugged, like a tractor, almost like a tractor, but just that it has given a SUV form. So what they were doing with Scorpio was a complete reimagined business and brand transformation. They were transforming themselves from a utility tractor kind of a company to a luxury SUV organization, right? That's how they were aiming for. Even till date, the last vehicle that they launched, XEV, if you look at it, the number of features that are there in XEV are not even there in some of the BMW cars. That's what Mahindra is not now known for, that it's just power packed with features, because that is the pulse of the Indian market. And one of the things that they did with this Scorpio launch was really go into market research, which didn't exist before. It was more like, this is what I have designed as a company, I will push it out to the market. But only with Mahindra Scorpio is when research sort of came into picture to sort of go to the market, identify what is the pulse of the company, what is the pulse of the consumers. They wanted affordability, but at the same time, the feel of luxury. And that's what you saw in Scorpio as well when they had launched. Yeah, maybe your thoughts.
I would like to echo with you actually, like same points, because I'm one of the buyer from Mahindra. I have bought XUV700 and same what you thought, like it's a complete value for money. So as a consumer, you are getting everything in that price segment. Yeah. And in the success story, like they have done it in 2000 around, but that was really a transformation for company. Now, if you see Mahindra, they are back to back, they are launching and they are innovating more in all the aspects. Like it's not just an engine. They have revolutionized. Now, if you see their next car, they are coming with the 3 screens. So they are taking it to next level. So I think that was the first step they have, whether it was a do or die, but they succeeded that. Now they are like sustaining and excelling that.
Yes, absolutely. I think very, very valid point that it was a lot of customer research that they did, went about asking people what is that they look for features, actually took them on test drives and all of that. The other thing which they have done as part of this exercise was this whole thing on rapid prototyping. And before that, rapid prototyping meant, actually creating the vehicle and then sort of testing it, which again was a very lengthy process. So they were able to figure out ways in which this prototyping can happen. Typically, in your organization, how many prototypes would you do on an average? Any number that you think of? Some number?
I'm sure you have done
Some number,
prototyping.
yeah. Some prototyping. How many prototypes do you actually create?
1 in 2 years.
1 in 2 years. They had done 100 prototypes. And now, XEV, they have done 200 prototypes. So to be able to make sure that what I'm delivering to the market, I'm able to do it rapidly is very important. And that's what you will see when you actually, some of you, should visit our Deloitte Center for Innovation. You'll see how some of these technologies are really enabling you to do this rapid prototyping. Because value to market is something which is very important. If you're taking 5 years, 6 years to launch a new product, by then the consumer taste preferences are changing, and now, if I'm not talking about the pace of change because that's another whole topic for me to talk for the next 1 hour, but pace of change earlier used to be measured in 10 years, that every 10 years a new iPhone would come, every 10 years something new was getting launched. But now the pace of change has gone from decades to years to actually minutes. Things are changing by the minute. So if you are not able to keep up with that pace, do rapid prototyping. It's a very, it's a different world that we are living in. So maybe those were few points. If you get time, please do go through the case study. It's very interesting. You'll have a lot of thoughts which will come from there. Before I just close, I thought I'll play this video. It's another case study which is on, again, manufacturing-led business transformation. And you'll see this another automotive company which really took bold bets to be able to do what they're doing currently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the jury. I can't say enough to express my appreciation for having this great honor bestowed on me. And I honestly will never forget this evening. Thank you. All through my career, there was one company that took most of my attention. That was Tata Engineering, which became Tata Motors. I spent much of my spare time, to the annoyance of some of my colleagues on that company, because the automotive industry to me was one of the most exciting industries I've been involved in. It involved design, style, technology, speed. It was just a life of its own. So today, to share this platform with icons of the industry is something that I'm just very humbled by. Before I sit down, I just thought I'd share with you the experience I had with Jaguar Land Rover when we bought it. We bought it, and that's too long a story, when Ford decided to sell. And my friends sort of distanced themselves from me by saying, "What are you going to do with this?" Quite frankly, I didn't know. And that refrain changed from "what are you going to do with this" to "how stupid could you be to buy this?" So eventually, my first meeting with the workers at Coventry and JLR was a horrible question. What are you going to do with this plant? Are we going to close down some of the plants that we have? We're hardly using the capacity. And I just had no way to say that I knew what we were going to do. So finally, I stood up and said, why don't we do this? Why don't we shoulder to shoulder recreate the image that these two brands had and reignite the power of those two brands? I'm pleased to say that I did nothing more. The team at JLR, led by Ralph, who has been the leader that I think deserves this award more than me, and the team at JLR just made a huge difference in this company. And today, if I'm here to receive this award, I would like to say that I receive it with humility on behalf of Ralph and the team at JLR, who are truly the deservers of this award. But as the award can't be given to 20,000 people, I accept this on their behalf, and thank you, sir, for making this possible. It's a great, great honor for me. Thank you.
So I've seen this video multiple times, and every time I see it, it gives me goosebumps, right? He spoke about recreating, reimagining, shoulder to shoulder. You know, that's the way people are transforming. That's how companies are transforming. And they are great examples which come from India. We don't have to look too far. We don't need to copy the West. We don't need to look at Apple and Tesla and all of that. We have really good examples in India. So with that, I close my session. But I want to open up for any questions, any reflections, thoughts, inputs that you might have, whatever we spoke in the last 1 hour. No thoughts? All clear? Any reflections? How to articulate digital transformation? Yes, because it's the art of storytelling as well, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
Benefits and also plan some adaptability. So how to take it as a concept?
Yes. So, you know, valid question, and this is something which comes up in every conversation, that I can't do, I can't just start, you know, from walking, I can't just leaping, you know, that way. But one of the fact of innovation, when we talk about innovation, there is something called as, you know, step-by-step innovation or continuous improvement kind of innovation, which all of us have mastered that, right? Continuous improvement is part of manufacturing for many years. But what we are talking here is step innovation, step improvement innovation, which is completely reimagining that this is how I do it. And a lot of us get that opportunity when we do greenfield manufacturing setup, right? We had set this up for, again, one of the largest aerospace companies, and they were coming up with one of the biggest integrated facility to manufacture helicopters. And that's when they took the approach, and when I tell you, I won't tell you the name of the organization, but it's a legacy organization, almost 70, 80 years old, with you know, rudimentary ways of working. It almost feels like that you are in some kind of a, you know, basic factory that there's no automation that is there. But they took the approach saying that the greenfield factory that I will set up, that's not going to be the one that I already have. That I'm going to be looking at it from a completely different lens, and that needs visionary leaders like, you know, Ratan Tata, Anand Mahindra. Similarly, within your organization, you'll have visionary leaders as well who are really thinking that this is not how I should run the business. There's a step improvement that I want to bring about as well.